So to introduce our first keynote speaker, we would like to welcome Adam Levin. They are a psychiatrist and postdoctoral scholar at the Center for Psychedelic Drug Research and Education, also known as the CPDRE. He completed his psychiatry residency at the Ohio State University and received his MD from the Louisiana State University of Medical School of Medicine in New Orleans. At the CPDRE, Adam acts as a medical monitor and therapist for clinical trials of psilocybin in veterans with PTSD and in cancer patients with depression. His general research interests include the use of psychedelics for individual and collective trauma, the neurobiological underpinnings of psychedelic action, and the broader implications of psychedelic medicine for medical education and practice. He recently published a new theory of psychedelic action called HEALS, which attempts to unify the common effects of psychedelics through the lens of their differential effects on the brain's hemispheres. So today, Adam will be discussing From Hemispheres to Healing Beyond Psychedelic Nihilism. If you would like to ask a question during their talk, please enter them using the Q&A function. And without further ado, let's give a warm welcome to Adam.
Thank you very much. Those are some amazing talks coming up today, by the way. I'm glad you listed those out, Dan. That's very cool. But let me share my screen. So, PowerPoint share. Okay, can you all see that? It's good. Okay, so let me start the timer because I want to leave some time at the end for questions. But Um, as Dan and Bianca mentioned, I'm going to be talking about From Hemispheres to Healing Beyond Psychedelic Nihilism. And most of the bulk of this talk, I'm going to be talking about my theory, which Bianca mentioned, about how psychedelics differentially affect the hemispheres of the brain. I'm really excited about this. This is actually the first time that I presented it publicly, so I'm excited to get feedback. I published the paper back in December, but I want to talk about it through this lens of what I call psychedelic nihilism. Um, and this is something that I've been thinking about. It's a term that's been brewing. And so I didn't talk about this in the paper, but this is kind of the first time I'm talking about it because I think it'll be fun and kind of stretch beyond, um, push the limits a little bit. So, um, here I am. I'm a postdoc at the CPDRE. As mentioned, I don't have any disclosures or conflicts of interest. So many of you may have heard of nihilism. So it's this philosophic school associated with Friedrich Nietzsche. And Nietzsche famously declared that God is dead in the 1800s. And this statement was meant to highlight the failing of the current moral order, right? And his general argument was that, scientific revolution got rid of religious truths. And so now we have no basis for truth. There's just nothing holding truth to reality. Morals are kind of constructed by human beings, and there's kind of nothing to point to, nothing to hold on to. And so many of you might have seen, for example, this is probably the modern instantiation of nihilism with the Joker and Batman, where the idea is, everything's socially constructed, right? And he kind of plays these moral games where he puts people into these situations where they have to kind of question traditional morals, traditional values, and it's really I would say, the philosophy of the postmodern era. The ideas and they're interesting and good ideas of social constructivism, um, ideas that moral relativism. Some of you may have heard these terms, but they're really entrenched in a lot of our views of the world and our views of academia, right? And so when I use the term psychedelic nihilism, I'm referring kind of narrowly to this idea that what emerges under psychedelics, so the patterns of belief and behavior and experience that emerge under psychedelics, are due primarily to culture or to set and setting. So many of you know the term set and setting, mindset being the mindset of the person going into the experience, and setting being the surroundings. And it's a strong argument, because we've known since the 1960s, since the 1970s, and even with indigenous traditions, right, how important mindset, how important setting and container are in influencing the experience. But I think, and I'm certainly not discounting that argument. I think there's, a lot of truth to that, but I think it can be taken too far. And really, I think it generally the movement of the field has been, I think, to take this idea too far. So I'll give you an example of this. Um, so this is a study of belief changes associated with psychedelic use. So this is where over 2,000 respondents rated 45 different belief statements from prior to after psychedelics. And so what came up a lot were these ideas about consciousness. And so you can see people rating from before to after psychedelics. So most people on this Zoom call would probably agree, right, that human beings are conscious, right? We would probably say, yes, other people are conscious. Most people would agree that primates are conscious, probably. People would probably agree that their pets are conscious, but eventually you'll get to a point where you'll say, no, that's not conscious. Like for example, inanimate natural objects, rocks, rivers, streams, those are not conscious. And what happened in this study, so again, people rating before to after psychedelics, is that these beliefs shifted. So if you look at, for example, plants, you can see before the psychedelic experience, 26% of people are saying plants are conscious, and after, 62% of people are agreeing with that statement. And this actually lasts beyond the experience. So you can see that last column, people maintain these beliefs, right? And so you have this general shift down I guess, down the evolutionary ladder towards consciousness, even people saying the universe is conscious. And the psychedelic nihilistic argument or the social constructive argument would be right that so psychedelics are used in the setting of these indigenous containers very often. And so many people that responded to this questionnaire probably took psychedelics in ceremonies like ayahuasca ceremonies, psilocybin ceremonies, etc. And so those indigenous traditions have beliefs consistent with this, consistent with animism. So they'll say plants are conscious, fungi are conscious, natural objects are conscious. And so what's happening is not that people's beliefs are changed from some internal force or some biological process. It's that people are absorbing, right, this cultural container. They're absorbing what's happening without around them, and there's no truth. Again, there's no real truth to their experience. It's just that they're very suggestible. And so a lot of times, for example, I mentioned animism. You'll see quotes like this. Sorry. You'll see quotes like this. So from psychedelics. So subjects revert to an animistic mode of thinking and become unable to differentiate animate objects from inanimate objects, saying that the watch is alive because it goes, or the moon is alive because it moves in the sky, or a stone is alive because electrons rotate within it, except that this is not a quote. And you've all heard these quotes probably or had experiences similar to this with psychedelics, except this is not a quote from a psychedelic experience. This is not a quote from a psychedelic experiment. This is a quote pulled from subjects who had their left hemisphere suppressed using transcranial magnetic stimulation. So there's no set and setting here, right? Presumably, this is an experiment that happened, in a lab where they had TMS machines. There's no cultural container. There's no influence of indigenous traditions. There's just this emergence, right, of these beliefs about the world. And this was really the basis, the beginning of my theory, because what I'm going to argue is very much the opposite, I would say, of this top-down constructivist idea that culture is influencing the beliefs. I'm going to argue that psychedelics actually pull out, unveil a system of viewing the world, which is associated with the right hemisphere. that is biologically instantiated. That's instantiated by evolution. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start, and this is what I do in my paper, and I'll try to get through as much of this as I can. But if you want more information, please go to my paper. But I'll start with evolution, and I'll talk about. Sorry, I was checking the chat. I'll start with evolution, and I'll talk about how and why the two hemispheres of the brain evolved. And then I'll talk about some of the recent neuroscientific evidence for the differences in the two hemispheres of the brain. And through this investigation, you'll start to see that, and I'll argue that each hemisphere has a really different and often conflicting view of the world. And I'll talk about that a lot. And then, once you start to understand these separate views, what I've done is basically talk about the phenomenology. So describe the views, the experiences of each of the hemispheres, and then compare them to experiences and beliefs that come up in psychedelics. And what I think that I've shown is that the right hemisphere world has a lot of overlap with the psychedelic world, and that it's too much to just be a coincidence. And so that's where my paper kind of ends. But what I want to do today, in bringing up this idea of psychedelic nihilism, is I want to kind of push beyond that into very speculative territory and talk about whether science and philosophy can actually investigate some of these claims. Should we investigate some of these claims scientifically? And then metaphysically, so the nature of reality. Can we actually understand the nature of reality based on psychedelic experiences? Um, okay, so it turns out that the split nervous system has been around evolutionarily for 500 million years. So this is C. elegans. Many of you may have learned about this in Bio 101, but basically it's this, tiny, I think it's a protozoan. It's like a worm, essentially, microscopic, but it has a split nervous system. And so anytime something has been around for 500 million years of evolution, it indicates that that is probably highly adaptive and very, very important, right? But what's interesting about this is that I was a neuroscience major in college, neuroscience, biology, and then I went to medical school. And really, when it comes to the split brain and the split hemispheres, I thought that they were just copies of one another. I thought that the left and right hemisphere were just redundant, essentially. I knew that the speech center was in the left hemisphere because you learn early in medical school that someone has a stroke on the left side, they often lose the ability to speak. So I knew that. But really, other than that, it was communicated to me that there were no differences between the hemispheres. And I think this is, frankly, the common scientific view that's perpetuated, that's taught. But luckily, there's a psychiatrist and neuroscientist named Ian McGilchrist who basically has spent his entire life and career elucidating, describing these differences between the hemispheres. And if you're interested in this topic, I would recommend picking up any of these books. But he lays out the foundations for a lot of, I owe a lot of my argument to Ian McGilchrist. So I just want to recognize that. And so he starts again with evolution. And his argument so the question, like, why do we have two different sides of the brain? How does that make sense? How has it been conserved for 500 million years? And his answer, and I think the widely accepted answer at this point, is that we require two really different types of attention on the world. So if you think about hunting and tracking, right? So you need this really narrow, focused window of attention to track prey. But simultaneously, you have to be aware of the entire field. You have to be aware of predators. You have to be aware of family members. You have to be aware of friends and foes. And it turns out that this is a very, very difficult problem to solve. Ian McGilchrist talks about it being like rubbing your head or tapping your head and rubbing your stomach. I think that's the the difficult thing to do. I can't do it right now, but it's way harder than that. It's almost an impossibility. And so keeping these two types of attention, it turns out the best way to do that, or the most efficient way to do that, was to separate them out so that they don't interfere with each other. And humans have really perfected this in the two hemispheres. So you can see here the two hemispheres, and between them is the corpus callosum there in red. And that is the connection point between the hemispheres. And so for a long time, it was thought that the corpus callosum was just basically a highway, that anything could get through, and the faster things got through between the hemispheres, the more efficient things function, the better off you were. But it turns out that the corpus callosum is actually mostly made up of inhibitory neurons. So its main function, again, is to actually separate, keep things separated, and to keep these modes apart from one another so that they don't interfere, right? And this led to Roger Sperry, who won a Nobel Prize for his work on the hemispheres, to declare that both the left and the right hemisphere may be conscious simultaneously in different, even mutually conflicting mental experiences that run along in parallel. So he's talking about, in a normal human being, there being parallel conscious experiences. And he won a Nobel Prize for this work. And I'll talk about one of his experiments because I think it's important. But before I do that, I want to just talk about this, what's called the split brain operation. And this is important because he had this population of split brain patients where he conducted these experiments. And so back at the time that he was studying this, there were no good seizure medications. So people were having grand mal, full body seizures, and there was no way to stop them. And so what they would do is they would actually cut the links between the hemispheres so that seizure, the seizure couldn't spread from one hemisphere to the other. So the person wouldn't have this full body seizure. And it's not done now, but back then, I think this was in the 60s and 70s, it was a very common operation. And so you ended up with populations of people whose brains were not, they had zero connection between the hemispheres. And so before I talk about the experiment, it's important also for the rest of my presentation. This is an important slide if you're watching. So basically, uh, the left side of the world, so left hand, left visual field, crosses over and is processed by the right hemisphere. And the right side of the world, so you see that ring there, crosses over and is processed by the left hemisphere. So again, your right hand is left hemisphere yielded. Your left hand is right hemisphere yielded. And so that's important to know. But so for this experiment, again, these are split brain patients. What Roger Sperry did, you can see there on the left panel, is he flashed, for example, the word face. And you can see that it's blocked from the left visual field. So it goes just to the left hemisphere. And then the left hemisphere, again, is where speech is located. One of the few things I had learned about in medical school, but it's where speech is located. So you can ask this person, what did you just see? And they'll say, I saw the word face. I saw the word face. But then if you take the same person, so again, same person, but hemispheres are split, and you show them this to the left visual field, so to the right hemisphere, and you ask them what they saw, they'll say, I didn't see anything. So the left hemisphere is saying, I saw nothing, has no way of accessing the information in the right, and so says, I saw nothing. But then if you hand the person a pen into their left hand and ask them what they saw, the right hemisphere, which saw this word, will draw a face. And I mean, I don't know, this is a fascinating study. Every time I describe it, it's like unbelievable to me because it means that there's two separate, in the same person, two separate conscious experiences that are not aware of one another. And so Roger Sperry concludes from this work that each hemisphere is a conscious system in its own right, perceiving, thinking, remembering, reasoning, willing, and emoting all at a characteristically human level. Right? So these two views, these two worlds, basically. And this was the bulk of my paper. Here it is. And the bulk of my paper was talking about these two worlds and then comparing them to the world of psychedelics. And so it's also important to understand before I dive into this that the left hemisphere in regular states of consciousness is dominant. So it constricts and restricts the right hemisphere to a significant degree. And so what I'll be talking about are these states of right hemisphere release or fusion. That's where the word annealing comes from, because I'm talking about states where the right hemisphere can fuse with the left. So here's just a summary of these different domains that I cover, and I'm not going to go through all of these. I went through all of them in my paper, but I'll touch on some things that I think are of particular interest, and that are just kind of fun experiments, fun things to talk about. But basically, I cover all of these domains, and you can see that I talk about the right hemisphere, the left hemisphere, and then the psychedelic phenomenology. And yeah, and I'll start with attention because I just talked about how again the left hemisphere requires this narrow focused attention for prey, and the right evolved for this broader, wide attentional window. And that's been well substantiated in the literature. And then, what you see under psychedelics is, and many of you have probably heard of these historical theories about like the brain being a reducing valve. So Henri Bergson was this philosopher who talked about the brain as a eliminative organ, filtering information. And then Aldous Huxley in The Doors of Perception after his mescaline experience talked about how psychedelics release this reducing valve, allowing for this like broader field of attention essentially to enter. And so the only caveat I would have with Huxley would be that the left hemisphere is acting as this reducing valve and the right is this broader field. And it also turns out that more recent neuroscientific evidence points to this. So, the CSTC gating model by Franz Vollenweider, Rebus, these are all, you can see the words in there: gating, relaxing precision, top-down priors. They're all about the release, the opening up, the release of this gating function. And so these theories focus on the front of the brain. The only difference is I'm focusing right on the hemispheric, the lateral differences. And then self-entropic broadening theory actually is probably the closest commentary about attention itself under psychedelics. And this is Katie Duran, published in 2022. And she talks about how there's this widening of the attentional window, right? Just like the right hemisphere function, this widened attention window, which allows for less self-focus, and may be responsible for a lot of the therapeutic effects of psychedelics. And then the phenomenology. So I spent a lot of time comparing quotes from people with left hemisphere damage, so right hemisphere release, to people under psychedelics. And so you can see here this person talking about birds flitting around among the dense dark green bushes. It was like I was seeing them in a new light. So this idea of novelty, this idea of kind of openness, right? When the left hemisphere is damaged, and then psychedelics, you have this person again uh, seeing this type of green I'd never experienced before, being among the trees. It was like experiencing them for the first time, so vibrant, so alive. So, I think if you took away the titles here, you would be hard pressed to differentiate between left hemisphere damage and psychedelics. Checking the time. Okay, so social and emotional intelligence was also a big part of what I covered. And it goes back to evolution and to attention, because again, with this broader part of the broader attentional window of the right hemisphere is attention to social and emotional experiences and social beings and social and family. And so these are some studies, some examples that I reviewed. You can see On the left there, this is a chimpanzee, I believe, that has she has her baby on the left side. And it turns out that this is not a coincidence. There's something called the left-sided cradling bias, and it's present in great apes and gorillas and chimpanzees and orangutans and gibbons and olive baboons. I even looked at walruses and other types of animals, but they most of the time will keep their children on the left side because it's the left eye, which crosses over to the right hemisphere, is keeping the face, the features, that social interaction in view. And so, and even if you notice, by the way, if your dog or probably not cat, but if your dog, you walk your dog and your dog prefers to be on the right side, it's because it has this left eye, which is looking at your face and it's connecting to the right hemisphere, and that's this social intelligence, right? And there's also this just fascinating study that I reviewed of statues of mothers with their children from 2000 BC to 0 BC. And it turns out that 99 out of 103 statues show a left cradling bias. And so this is conserved in humans. And I've noticed this in myself. I have a 1-year-old and I've noticed my proclivity to hold her in my left hand. And again, it's this connection to the right hemisphere, this crossover. And so that's evolutionary evidence. And then we come to this neuroscientific imaging, experimentation evidence, and you find, and this is with regard to empathy. So I'm going to I talk about other forms of social intelligence, but I'll talk about empathy specifically because it was just so clear to me when comparing it with psychedelics that there was overlap. So, emotional empathy is this feeling of resonance. So you're sharing in the emotions with others. You're connecting, right? Someone's sad, and you're feeling the sadness. So it's this emotional contagion, in a sense. And then there's cognitive empathy, and cognitive empathy is sort of the post hoc, abstracted explanation, understanding of the state of others. So it kind of is like an inference about the experience of others, and there's a big difference there. Sociopaths can have cognitive empathy, where they are simply they understand the states of others cognitively, but they're using it to manipulate people because they often don't have that shared emotional empathy. And so it turns out that that emotional empathy is very, very localized to the right hemisphere. So the right frontal lobe, the anterior insula, the right temporoparietal junction. These are all the centers of emotional empathy, whereas cognitive empathy is bilateral, but also mostly located on the left. And so, yeah, just remember this because when it comes to psychedelics, and this was one of the key moments when I realized like this certainly isn't just a coincidence. Um, but when I saw basically that there's this enhanced emotional empathy under psychedelics, so this is a lot of studies with high sample sizes. But the cognitive empathy is often not changed or even slightly reduced. So you have, I would argue, this shift into the right hemisphere functions. And then phenomenologically, so again, looking at what people say, how people describe their experiences. So I always tell the story about ayahuasca and the discovery of harmine, which is an alkaloid in ayahuasca. And Fisher, who discovered this harmine, wanted to name it telepathine because of the experience people describe under ayahuasca ceremonies where they feel as if they're so in touch with others that they're basically having this telepathic communication. And I was surprised to find this is a description of patients with left hemisphere strokes from Ian McGilchrist and right hemisphere release that they describe a similar pattern of communication. So McGilchrist says that he and other similar patients could communicate insights between one another without speaking, right? So this telepathy. And then Jill Bolte Taylor, who's a neuroscientist, actually, who wrote this book called My Stroke of Insight, she had a left hemisphere stroke, so releasing her right hemisphere. And she wrote this entire book about it, and she even suggests in the book that people with left hemisphere strokes might be used as lie detectors because of how sensitive they are emotionally, how in tune, again, this almost telepathic form of connection that they have. So again, you have this overlap between the psychedelic phenomenology and the right hemisphere phenomenology. Okay, I'm going to talk about, hopefully I think there's messages, but I think can wait till the end. Oh, Q&A. Okay, so I'm going to talk about creativity and music because I go into a lot of detail in the paper about creativity. I talk about insight, I talk about language and metaphor, but one of the most clear and interesting examples of creativity for me was music. And you can see here that the left hemisphere again is the center of speech. So speech is very much located in the left hemisphere, but the right hemisphere processes harmony, tone, pitch resolution, prosody, rhythm, complex rhythms, and even singing. So speech in music is processed by the right hemisphere. So if you've ever seen, for example, the movie The King's Speech, when he has this problem with stuttering and he can't deliver the speech, he sings, right? And he's able to do it flawlessly because it's switching from this left hemisphere mode to this right hemisphere mode. And there's a lot of examples of that in people with strokes who lose the ability to speak, but they can still sing in this amazing way. They can sing the words that they couldn't speak. And so most of you probably know just how associated music is, right, with psychedelic therapy, with psychedelics. There's a lot of evidence that psychedelics increase musical appreciation. They increase music liking, they increase music resonance. They're associated with even with therapeutic outcomes. And Mendel Kaelin has even called music the hidden therapist in psychedelic therapy because of, just how important of a role music plays. And I actually reviewed, there was only one study with imaging and music that I could find, but it actually showed that there was an increase in right amygdala activation with music. So it's kind of this nice pairing between my theory and the evidence. So phenomenology of music. So there was amazingly a lot of examples of people who had left hemisphere strokes and without any previous music ability and who would suddenly develop, perfect pitch. There's this one case report of the 57-year-old man who had a left stroke and spontaneously started singing with no errors in pitch, rhythm, and kind of inventing these songs out of whole cloth. And then there's this example of the composer, his name's Alfred Schnittke, and he describes his output being, quote, 3 times greater than it had been before his left hemisphere stroke. And he describes this new ability with music where he feels like he can visualize the final shape of the piece. He can actually sort of see the music. And what this stuff reminds me of is the experience of Shipibo shamanic training under ayahuasca, which I read quite a bit about as part of this paper. And often people who go through this training who are drinking ayahuasca regularly, they have no musical proclivities before often. But then as they go through this process of shamanic training and as they're engaging with psychedelics and with ayahuasca, they begin to learn songs, which they describe as, receiving directly from the plants. And so this is a quote from Joe Tafur, who wrote a book called The Fellowship of the River about his training in Shipibo shamanism. And similar to the composer that I mentioned with the left hemisphere stroke, he talks about this new ability, new ability to see the music. He says, I started singing in a way that I had never sung before. There was an energetic vibration to my voice, and I started making mysterious tones. The ayahuasca guided me through the process, informing me through the feeling in my body. So again, this interesting overlap. And yeah, I'll put this here again. I think I didn't cover everything, but if you want more details, you can certainly look in my paper. But basically what I found with these two worlds, right, is that the right hemisphere and psychedelics feature this broadened, open attention with reduced filtering. They both feature increases in emotional intelligence, emotional tone, and empathy. I didn't cover sense of self, but experiences of ego dissolution are associated with left hemisphere damage. And so Jill Bolte Taylor, this neuroscientist who I described, had this experience of ego dissolution following her left hemisphere stroke. And many of you know ego dissolution is associated with psychedelics. I talked about music. I talked about metaphor a bit. I'll talk about insight in a moment. But I also like, all of that is the bulk of the paper, but ultimately it's circumstantial, meaning I'm pointing out similarities between these states, but there's not any concrete evidence. So I actually it's a little bit more boring, so I didn't go into too much detail about it, but I reviewed a lot of, I think, all of the imaging studies that mentioned laterality. And there's a lot of caveats with psychedelic imaging, as many of you probably know. I actually have an appendix for the paper talking about some of these caveats, but there's small sample sizes. Some of them are reused sample sizes. But putting all of that aside, what I found in this review was a lot of evidence for increased right hemisphere metabolism and right hemisphere hyperfrontality under psychedelics. And so you can look at a lot of this. I think there's 10 studies here, but this is kind of a actually GPT generated image from my findings, which found basically this increase in frontal and temporal blood flow. And it's hard to make definitive comments about this just because of all the caveats with imaging. But it seemed like the evidence was clear to me. And this is also consistent, by the way, with Rebus and other studies which point to this increased frontal hyperfrontal activity. So, okay. In the time that I have left, I want to go back to the beginning when I talked about nihilism and I talked about what is true and I talked about what can we say about science and philosophy and about metaphysics based on psychedelics. And these are ideas that I've just had. I didn't include this in my paper, but it's something that I've been thinking about, right? And to illustrate this, to start this discussion, or to illustrate this, I want to talk about the world of the left hemisphere. And so we've talked a lot about the experience of someone with an enhanced right hemisphere with a left hemisphere stroke, but I want to talk about the world of someone who has lost their right hemisphere. And so what you see here, this is a drawing by someone, a patient who has what's called hemispatial neglect. And so occurs almost exclusively under conditions of right hemisphere damage, right? So the right hemisphere, left side of the world, losing contact with that. But if you have left hemisphere damage, and in other words, most people keep a view of the whole world. So, so again, hemispatial neglect, right hemisphere stroke, and you can see this person has drawn all of the numbers on the clock, right? You ask them, can you draw a clock? They know what a clock is. They draw all the numbers, but they leave out the entire left part of this. And similar things happen with, for example, you ask someone, can you copy this drawing of a house or can you copy this drawing of a cat? You see that things, as you shift into the left side of the world, into the right hemisphere's view, things fade away because they've had this damage. But it's important to highlight, and one of the most tragic parts about these cases, which I've seen as a psychiatrist as well, is that there's a total lack of insight. So it's not that they're just losing the left side of their visual field. It's that they're not aware that there's a left side of the world. So you can ask, where's your left hand? And they'll say, I don't have a left hand, or they'll come up with some form of denial. Or you can ask them, who's on the left, which person's on the left, and they'll say no one's on the left, or there's nothing on the left, right? So they don't have insight into this condition. But what's interesting and quite tragic actually is that you can briefly induce the right hemisphere. You can briefly activate the right hemisphere using something called caloric vestibular stimulation, which is a fancy term for literally pouring cold water basically into someone's ear so that the entire hemisphere, which has been damaged, is sort of briefly activated. And so what happens, and again, it's sad and moving to read accounts of this, but people will suddenly come into contact with the left side of the world. And they'll have this experience actually of like awe almost, like how could I have missed this left side? Like how could I be existing and functioning in the world without an awareness that I'm living with this left side of the world and then I have a left side of my body and all of these other things. And then it eventually it fades away, right? But what this experience of awe, what this encounter reminded me of was my experience as, as the introduction mentioned, I'm also a therapist in our clinical trials with psychedelics. And so I'm thinking of, I've been working with veterans with PTSD as part of our trial. And often I'm thinking of a dosing session from a few weeks ago, but often people will have this experience of, wow, how could I have been, seeing the world through this narrow lens of trauma for so long? How have I been missing out on this wider space? And it's these flashes of insight, these flashes of awe. My world, I am much bigger than this. It's these flashes that really remind me of each other, right? And so when it comes to the right hemisphere stimulation, to the left hemisphere stroke and the right hemisphere stimulation, it's easy to make truth statements about that, right? We can say, the person, when they're encountering the left side of the world, they're encountering the truth because it's our consensus reality. We know we're physicians in the room or we're family in the room. We know there's a left side of the world. We can all agree on that. But it's much, much harder, obviously, to make truth claims about psychedelic insights because, like this claim about consciousness extending down, it's really hard this is goes so far against our own worldview, particularly in the West, that it's easy to dismiss this. And it's also, impossible to prove, which is the standard thing. Subjective experience is impossible to prove. How can we investigate something like this scientifically? But, my argument is actually that people are already doing this scientifically. And there's panpsychism, which many of you may have heard of, is a philosophic school. And it's a very widely respected, and there's mathematicians and physicists and others working on this that actually says that the view of it is that consciousness goes all the way down to the fundamental building blocks of reality. So atoms, molecules have some fundamental level of consciousness. And this is something that's taken very seriously in academia at this point. It's one of the leading theories of consciousness, and it's matching up with people's subjective experiences under psychedelics. And so, and the other thing just to close is that there's this idea in science or about science that's I think really taken hold over the last 20, 30 years, which is that science is just different than every other discipline. It's cordoned off. It's just stringing together objective facts, and it's the truth, capital T truth, and it's separate from other realms of, creativity like spirituality. It's a separate thing. But I always kind of laugh at this because I think about I took some courses about the history of science, and this is Niels Bohr, who worked in the hardest of hard sciences, physics, right? So we're talking about psychology, social sciences. And this is a physicist who discovered, one of the leading figures in quantum mechanics. And he was immersed in mystical Advaita Vedanta. He was immersed in these mystical ideas, and so was Heisenberg and all of these leading figures in physics. If you know anything about their biographies, they were mystics and they were influenced by these ideas. And so I would just say that like science is already influenced by ideas like this. So My question is, what would a psychedelically informed science look like? And I'm not a physicist. I'm not a mathematician. So I'm not going to be the one to do this, but maybe some of you will. And, or maybe there's people out there like Philip Goff who are looking into some of these things. So hopefully that leaves 5 minutes for questions. I want to thank Ian McGilchrist again, who inspired a lot of my work here. I want to thank everyone at the CPDRE. And also, here's my paper. It may be behind a paywall. So if anyone wants to look at the paper, please just send me an email and I'll send you a PDF. So thank you. And I can look at questions now.
Thank you, Adam, for your talk. That was super interesting and I feel like super inspiring for our audience. So one of the questions that we've received, our audience member says, "Hi, Dr. Levin. Thanks for the very interesting talk. How do you think your hypothesis can influence psychedelic research moving forward? And on the more clinical side, could this model of psychedelics releasing the right hemisphere be incorporated into treatments for patients?"
Uh, Sorry, can you hear me? Am I still okay?
Got
So
you.
how can it influence it? So I think the first thing that's needed is to look at whether this is using imaging and other things, whether this is true. Because like I call for more imaging and more studies. And I actually think one way to do this, you can actually administer drugs specifically to each hemisphere. And so a lot of the experiments that I looked at, they anesthetize the right hemisphere separately, and then you're talking to the left hemisphere, or you're anesthetizing the left hemisphere. And so my suggestion at the end of the paper, is to actually do that with a psychedelic and see if there's any differences between the experiences. And so I think that would be really interesting. The other thing to do is just do more imaging studies looking specifically at laterality. Um, clinically, um, clinically, I'm not sure. I mean, I think it's interesting to think about whether you could use something like transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is actually being used a lot in psychiatry. If you could use that in pairing with psychedelics so that you could actually focus on some of these areas that may be responsible, that may be stimulated in the right hemisphere, and actually kind of extend maybe some of the therapeutic outcomes. So hopefully that helps.
I think we have time for one more question. Dan, would you like to ask another question from the audience?
Sure. Um, let's see. Do you want, Adam, do you want a really specific question, and niche one, or do you want like a high level one that's educational?
I like high level, but because the niche ones, I can, if people send me emails, I can respond to the niche ones.
Okay, cool. So someone asked, why do you say, quote unquote, two conscious experiences to the two hemispheres when these are evidently processes that we are not conscious of, but rather are responsible for the different modes of attention? And then in parentheses, they put narrow focus versus wide overview.
Well, I think so. If the question is two separate conscious experiences, I go back. So consciousness is hard to talk about because there's just so many ideas about consciousness and what it is. But when I say consciousness, I just mean um, any felt experience, like a the experience of experiencing, essentially. So when I say two conscious experiences that are separated, I'm thinking about those that the Roger Sperry experiments where he's basically interrogating each of the hemispheres and asking the same person, what did you see in this image? And because again, the left hemisphere is the only one with speech, the left hemisphere says, I didn't see anything. I didn't, and so the person is saying, I saw nothing. So presumably that person thinks that they didn't see anything. But then if you give them a pen in their left hand, they can actually draw what they saw. So it's this bizarre situation where part of them knows there's some consciousness within them that knows, yet they are not able to say it. And like this is a case of I have 1 minute left, but I'll just close. Like this is a case where the hemispheres are fully split. But I would again say that actually for functional hemispheres, the corpus callosum is mostly separating them out. So even in our experience, I would say there's a possibility of multiple views of consciousness, right? Of points of view in a single person, which is, and again, maybe this explains why under psychedelics, there's this sense of familiarity. It's like, oh, I'm coming home to this experience. I'm experiencing something that is familiar, yet I feel like I've been here before, but it's new. And like maybe that's because there's this encounter with the right hemisphere, which has been moving along in the background the whole time. So anyway, hope that's helpful.
That's super helpful. I really like the way you bridged it from like a double-blind, low-level explanation to like a much higher, like integrative type of perspective.
Sure.
Thank
Um,
you so much, Adam. And we'll follow up and send you the rest of the questions that were asked during your talk. And if you would like, you can drop your email in the chat or
sure.
website so our attendees can check out your work or follow up to contact you if they have more questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate it. And it's an amazing conference. So good luck, everyone.